Hello and welcome to the daily newspaper analysis. Today we shall be discussing the newspaper of the 29th of January 2018. So coming to the first article, a vote for state funding. The opinion is that electoral bonds cannot clean up campaign finance. Now this entire topic and the editorial is of utmost importance. It is going to have huge relevance in UPSC mains. I'm sure you're going to find ample scope to replicate these ideas in your answers. So that is the importance of it. Now coming to the context. First and foremost, you need to understand the gist of this editorial. Now the gist here is that about the funding of political parties and the entire election process in the country is something that is not transparent, and indeed they are warranting accountability. So that is the gist. Now why is this topic important, which is the context? First and foremost is that recently the Association for Democratic Reforms has released its report, and as per this report, 70% of the funding of all the political parties is through unknown sources. So this indeed is a reflection of lack of transparency. So that is one important aspect. Another thing is that there have been certain budgetary reforms in this regard. Now, first and foremost, you need to understand that what was the pattern before the reforms. Before the reforms, there was a trend that there was a limit of 20,000 rupees, as per which if there is a donation to a political parties which is less than 20,000 rupees, I'm talking here of cash donations. So if there is a cash donation of less than 20,000 rupees, then in that case, anonymity of the person is going to be maintained. And not only that, the political party is not supposed to report that donation to the Election Commission of India. However, only cash donations above 20,000 rupees was something that the political parties had to report to the Election Commission of India, and not only that, the anonymity of the person was not maintained. Now, after the budgetary reforms, this limit has been reduced now to rupees 2,000. This was in the aftermath of demonetization, as the government is largely focusing on a cashless system. So even for political parties, they have reduced this limit. So now what will happen is that if I make a donation to a political party which is less than 2,000 rupees, then in such a scenario, I will not have to divulge my identity, and the political party will not have to report this donation to the Election Commission of India. However, if a donation greater than 2,000 rupees is made, then in that case, this reporting has to be done to the Election Commission of India, and also I shall not be ensured my anonymity. So that is one reform that has been introduced in the budget of 2017. Another thing is that in the same year, 2017 budget has proposed an electoral bond scheme. This scheme is aimed at bringing more transparency in the funding of political parties. We shall be analyzing this scheme in detail further. Also, there are some other changes which have been introduced. For example, there has been an amendment to the Foreign Contribution and Regulation Act of 2010. Also, there has been a Finance Bill 2017. So these changes are something which has again made this entire topic important and more relevant in the present times. Now, before we delve into the issues, we'll be discussing some background of this issue. Now, first and foremost is with regards to the political party funding. Now, this idea of corporate sector funding the political parties is not something new, and it is age old. It is happening from in the years of 1920s, when the Indian National Congress received funds from businessmen and corporate houses. For example, Mr. J.R.D. Tata was an integral part of the Indian National Congress himself. So this is not largely an unethical practice, but rather it is a norm, and this is continuing. But the issue is that the matter has become extremely closed and opaque now, and as a result of which, because of lack of accountability and lack of transparency, this has become something unethical. So that is one analysis which is important here. Now also you need to understand that why do these political parties require funding? Now these political parties require funding for the day-to-day activities, also for election processes. For example, during elections, these political parties hold campaigns, they issue advertisements, they hold rallies. For all of these things, they require funding, and as a result of which they are funded by donations. Now, what are the three sources of funding? The three sources of funding are, first and foremost, the individual source. This includes people like us. If we want to make a contribution to a political party, then we can simply donate whatever we want to that political party. So it will be under the ambit of the individual donation. The second source is an organizational contribution. In this regard, what is important is that the organization should not be a government organization, and so a private organization is who can fund a political party. Also, the third source is the taxpayers funding the political parties. Now, how does this happen? This happens is because the government often provides concessions to the political party. It provides subsidized land to the political party for making its offices. So in all of these regards, the political party is receiving money of the taxpayer. It is receiving public funding. So that is the third source of the political party's funding. Now coming to the foreign companies, Previously, foreign companies were not allowed to fund political parties. This was largely in the interest of the country because it was believed that if foreign companies are allowed to fund political parties, it will lead to a lot of lobbying, and it will also ensure that foreign countries can influence the political process in the country. So in this regard, it was prohibited. However, there was a case in the year 2014. What happened is that Vedanta, which is a foreign company, and Vedanta has only subsidiaries in India. So Vedanta decided to fund political parties, and despite the fact that Vedanta was not allowed to fund political parties under the Foreign Contribution and Regulation Act, it did fund some of the political parties. The matter came before the Delhi High Court in the year 2014, and the Delhi High Court held Vedanta guilty and of illegal provisions under the FCRA Act, and as per this, Vedanta was charged for this crime. Then the matter went to the Supreme Court, and at present the matter is sub judice with the Supreme Court. Not only that, in the aftermath of this Vedanta case, the government ensured some amendments to the FCRA 2010 Act. Now, what it did is that previously, as I said, foreign companies were not allowed to fund political parties. So, as per the amendments now, these foreign companies can contribute to the political parties. Now, how can they contribute? Suppose this foreign company A has a subsidiary in India B, where it has invested as per the norms of the foreign direct investment. So, through this subsidy, it can now fund the political parties. So this is something that is important. For example, this company has a stake greater than 51% in this company. So if once the stake is beyond 51%, then this company is entirely foreign. It cannot be said as an Indian company. So despite the fact that this company will be a foreign company inherently, it can contribute. So this is one of the amendments which the FCRA Act has introduced, which have been made to the FCRA Act. Another amendment which has been introduced is that these laws are to be made retrospectively. Despite the fact that these amendments were introduced in the year 2017, these are to be implemented from the year 2010. So this by many people is being viewed as a favoring by the government to bail out the Vedanta. So that is one issue, that is one important controversy that is with regards to the funding of political parties. Another thing is that the government has introduced a finance bill 2017. As per this finance bill, two changes have been made. First is that previously there was a limit to which the private companies could contribute to political parties, and this limit was set as 7.5% of the maximum profit of these companies in the past 3 years. Now, as per this finance bill 2017, this limit has been done away with. So at present there is no limit to contributions by a foreign company, and as much as it wants, a foreign company can contribute. That is the first aspect. Another amendment which has been made is that once a private company was funding a political party, it was supposed to show this donation in its profit and loss statement, and not only that, it had to also show that to which particular political party it has made that donation. This provision has again been done away with. So now the private company which is financing a particular political party need not show which political party it has contributed to. Also, it need not show that donation in its profit and loss statement. So these amendments in the Finance Bill 2017 are being viewed by many as a dilution of the provisions of funding by the private sector to the political party. So this is something that is again important. Another aspect which is important in the background is the electoral bond scheme. Now, what is this electoral bond scheme? This is a scheme which the government has introduced to ensure greater transparency in the financing of the political parties. Now, what does this scheme ensure? As under this scheme, some banks are going to be selected by the RBI, and these scheduled banks will issue bonds which will be known as the electoral bonds, and donations to political parties can be made through these electoral bonds. Now, suppose I want to make a contribution of 10,000 rupees to a particular political party. So I will go to the selected bank, whichever the selected bank by the RBI. For example, SBI has been selected. So I will go to this bank and I will buy bonds, electoral bonds worth rupees 10,000 rupees. After buying these bonds, I will go to the BJP office. Suppose I want to make a donation to the BJP. I will go to the BJP office. I will deposit these electoral bonds, and the BJP will go to another bank within a time frame of 14 days, because this is a short-term bond, and it will get a credit of 10,000 rupees into its account. So this is the entire process. The benefit of this process is that the entire system will become digital, and there will be no need to have they will make the entire system cashless. That is one intention, that is one benefit. But what is the the issue here is that this electoral bond is a bearer bond, which means that it will not have any name. So once there is no name, so definitely there is no identity, and this can be a secretive contribution. So that is one important analysis with regards to the electoral bonds. Another issue that is important in this regard is with regards to the RTI. Now you need to understand here that all political parties have an exemption under the IT Act. Under Article 13A of the IT Act, they are not supposed to pay an income tax to the government. However, despite the fact that they do not pay an income tax, they are supposed to file their income tax returns. So, the citizens thought that because these political parties are filing an income tax return, so to bring about greater transparency in their funding, these income tax returns should be open in the public domain through the RTI Act. And for this, some requests were made to the Chief Information Commissioner of the RTI, and the Chief Information Commissioner issued an order that yes, political parties are public bodies. They are availing huge amount of benefits from the taxpayers' money. So in that regard, the taxpayers should have the right to know about these fundings to the political parties, and the ITR should be in the public domain. So in the aftermath of this judgment by the Chief Information Commissioner, all political parties got together and they objected to this judgment. So at present, this issue is again with the Supreme Court. So that is what is the background of this entire topic. Now coming to some issues which have been discussed in the editorial and which are relevant in this regard. The first is with regards to India's election process. Now here you need to understand the magnanimity of the entire election process in India. Not only from the entire from the point of view of process, also from the point of view of finance. This is a huge exercise, and in this regard, the funding of political parties is something that is becoming very, very complex because of the sheer finance that is involved in the election process. So this challenge that the India's election process is facing is what has been highlighted by the author. The second issue that the author has analyzed in the editorial is that of the main source of funding. Now here, as I told you previously, that there are three sources. One is the individual source, one is the organizational source, and one is the taxpayer source. In all these three sources, the second source, which is the organizational source, and even in the organization, the private corporate sector, that is the highest source of contribution. So this is something that has been analyzed here. The third issue that has been analyzed is with regards to the public disclosure system. Now here you need to understand that the political parties are largely working in an opaque environment, and there is a lack of disclosure by them. So what are the provisions at present of disclosure? There are two provisions. Either they will disclose their financing through the Election Commission of India, or they will disclose their financing through the income tax returns that they are filing. Now, for the Election Commission of India, they are supposed to divulge only those incomes which were previously above 20,000 rupees and now 2,000 rupees. However, as we saw previously, that only 70%, that only 30%, 70% is through unknown, and so only 30% of this is reported to the Election Commission of India. So there is a clear analysis that there is a shortage of information. There is a lapse in the disclosure. So that is one thing that is clear. Another thing is with regards to the income tax returns that these political parties are filing. These are not in the public domain. The parties have refused to ensure to come under the ambit of the RTI. So again, this is something that is opaque, and the public has no information about this funding. So the public disclosure system is the weakest link in the entire chain of financing of political parties. So that is the analysis here. Another thing is with regards to the global practices. Now you need to understand that India as a country, as a democratic country, is unique because the process, the huge magnanimity of India's election process is rarely replicated anywhere in the world. However, even in smaller countries, the practices that are followed are largely two. One is either of state funding, that is the government is itself funding the election process, or the second practice is, for example, in a country like US, the case of US has been given because US is the only country which comes next to India in holding elections of the magnanimity of India. For the US presidential elections are close to India's election process. So that is something that has been analyzed here. Now, even in US, the state is not funding the elections, but there is huge amount of transparency in the funding of the political parties in US. So this is a model which even India should adopt, and it should not give its own, the magnanimity of its election process as an excuse for opaqueness in the system. So that is something that has been advocated in the editorial. Another thing is with regards to an issue of level playing field. Now this is a very, very important analysis because you need to understand that if election process is going to be so heavily financed, then in that case there will be no level playing field, because if a candidate from some modest background wants to fight an election, he will be at a disadvantage to his competitor who can finance his elections so heavily. So that is one analysis which has been drawn, that if election expenses are reduced or financing of political parties is checked, then in that case a level playing field can be ensured. Democracy is all about allowing every single person to fight elections. And if this is something that is only in word and on ground, this is something that cannot be manifested, then this is a huge cause of concern. That is what is important here. Now, coming to the next analysis is with regards to 70 years of independence. Here the author has brought about an analysis where she says that it has been 70 years of India's independence, and still India has failed to ensure a transparent process of funding of elections. So this is a major cause of concern, because in 70 years India has taken huge credit for its robust democracy. So the author is challenging that credit itself. She's saying that if India's entire process is not transparent, then how can India claim that democracy in India is fair? So that is one analysis which has been drawn. Another issue is with regards to anonymity in electoral bonds. Now you need to understand that anonymity itself in the election funding process is a virtue. It is not something entirely wrong. Why? Because anonymity ensures that the person who is contributing to a particular political party is not harassed by the opponents. So this is a protection to the donor. However, in the electoral bond process, this is something that is being questioned. Why is it being questioned here? Is because there is no limit on the anonymity. Previously, as I told you, there was a limit of first 20,000 and now 2,000 rupees. But in the electoral bond process, there is no such limit. Even if I want to contribute 50,000 rupees to a political party, I can do it anonymously through the electoral bond scheme. So definitely this is a cause of concern, and this is a major criticism to the electoral bond scheme. So this is something that has been analyzed. Another issue is with regards to misuse of power by the government. Now, need to understand that in the electoral bond process, there is such opacity that only the bank will know that who has made the payment. I will go to the bank and I will ask the bank to take 50,000 rupees from my account and give me electoral bonds. So only the bank will have this data as to who has made a contribution. Now here the author is fearing that the banks do not have any particular protection for this particular information. So if a government is elected, then what the government can do is that the government can coerce these banks to provide this information to the government, which the government can adversely use. So this is one threat which has been highlighted, and this indeed needs to be plugged. So that is one analysis which has been given. Another thing is with regards to the opacity of Election Commission of India, the Income Tax Department and the voter. Whatever these electoral bonds that are going to be purchased, they will never come under the scrutiny of the Election Commission of India, because previously there was a clause with regard to only cash, but there is no such clause with regards to the electoral bonds. So definitely this is outside the ambit of the Election Commission of India. Also, this is not going to be included in the ambit of the Income Tax Department. Another thing is that the voter will have no knowledge of this. Now this voter knowledge is something that again you should understand. With an example, I'll explain it. That suppose there is a mining company and I am fighting elections in a state where mining is prevalent. Now, if this mining company is funding my election process, then in that case, what will happen is that I will have a moral burden of, or even if not a moral burden, there can be a nexus between me and this mining company, that once I come to power, I will reciprocate back and I will favor the mining company. Now, in this process, it could happen that some tribal rights in the region could be impacted. So, before my voters are voting for me, they should know that I have taken this funding from the mining company so that they can make a better judgment and they can decide fairly. If this is a closed nexus, if this is not something that is clear, then it might happen that these tribals might vote for me despite the fact that I am taking funding from this mining company. So this entire nexus defeats the process of transparency in a democracy and makes the entire process a hoax. So this is something that you need to understand. This is the entire importance of this analysis here. Another thing is that of institutionalized corruption. This has again been analyzed in this article. This as it is evident in this particular example also, that this is indeed a case of institutionalized corruption. This has been called a wellspring of corruption, because if political parties are going to take such unregulated funding from the corporate houses, then it is going to amount to something of a hijacking of power by the corporate houses, and these will impact the policies of the government, and as a result of which the vulnerable groups who cannot pay the political parties are going to be adversely impacted. And this is the nexus of corruption in this country, is what has been analyzed here. Another thing is with regards to the issue of amendments to the Foreign Contribution and Regulation Act. This I have explained elaborately in the background also. So definitely in the amendments that the government has made with regards to allowing foreign companies, and also the retrospective aspect is something that is an unwelcome precedent. So that is what has been repeated here. Another thing is with regards to the Finance Bill 2017, as I mentioned, it has diluted the provisions of setting a maximum limit of 7.5%. Now there is no limit, and also it is not mandatory for companies to note the name of the political parties in their profit and loss statement. So that is one analysis. Another thing is with regards to refusal of the political parties to come under the RTI. This is a major question, and also raises questions on the relevance of the RTI itself. It erodes the faith of the people in the RTI itself. So that is one analysis which is important here. Another thing that is of relevance is the recommendations of the other committees. Here the editorial discusses that time and again other committees have been recommending some reforms within the for some electoral reforms, and they have been continuously suggesting that transparency needs to be introduced in the funding of political parties, but these recommendations are not something that are being heeded to by the government or the political parties themselves. So that is a major cause of concern. Another thing, as I mentioned before also, that the electoral bonds above 20,000 rupees are now under no control, and they are not to be reported to the Election Commission of India. So this is something that is a cause of concern, and this is a major criticism against the electoral bond scheme. So that is something that is important here. Now next, coming to some suggestions which have been given in this article. First and foremost is a set of some general suggestions. For example, a strong disclosure norms, strict statutory limits on election expenses, ceiling on corporate donations to political parties. Another thing is that rules to limit and restrict the campaign expenditure of parties. So these are some general set of suggestions which you can give, but a major suggestion is a particularly specific suggestion is with regards to the state funding of election. This has been also suggested in the year 1998 by the Indrajit Gupta committee, which was a committee formed for studying the possibility of state funding of elections in India. So even this committee said that at least, if not fully, then at least partial funding needs to be done by the state. Now again, one analysis is important here. It might be argued that India is already constrained in finances, and in this regard, the election process being a very expensive process, in this it is a waste of the scarce funds, which these funds could be used for welfare activities. So it is not very wise to spend this funding on elections. But here you need to understand that election is the check of a democratic process, and if election is something that is going to be a farce and unfair, then the entire idea of democracy is flawed. So in that regard, if elections are sponsored by the state, and if the exchequer has to take that burden, and he gets rid of the nemesis of corruption, then definitely this is a good deal, and indeed it should be advocated. So that is one important analysis which you need to understand. So that is what is relevant here. Another thing is that you need to understand that the author has given a suggestion that there should be a proper structuring of the entire state funding for election. It should be divided between national parties, state parties, and independent candidates. So this structure is what has been advocated, and then there is a need for designing this structure to ensure that efficient state funding of elections can be ensured. Another thing is that a final opinion that the author has given is that the state funding of elections will ensure that democracy works for everyone and not for the wealthy few. So this is a key statement which you can replicate in your answers. As I mentioned before also, the editorial is of much relevance in UPSC. So that is the importance of this article. Coming to the next article, Red Alert on Green Index. Now coming to the context is that India has ranked 177 of the 180 countries in the Environmental Performance Index. Now coming to some background, first and foremost, previously in the year 2016, India had got a rank of 141. So India has slipped back. So that is a cause of concern. Another thing is that something about the Environmental Performance Index itself. This is an index that is produced jointly by the Yale and the Columbia University. And this is done in collaboration with the World Economic Forum. So this has some relevance to it. Another thing is that this index ranks on 24 performance indicators, and also it has some 10 categories. So these are some details which you should just know. And also a ranking has been given for China as well as for Brazil. Brazil has got a rank of 69 and China has got a rank of 120. So both Brazil and China, which are also developing economies and have similar challenges as India has, have scored better than India. So definitely this is a cause of concern. So this is what is important here. Now coming to the issues which have been raised in this particular editorial. The first is with regards to the relevance of the index. Now previously we discussed that the ease of doing business index is something that is under question, and it is said that this index could be highly politicized. Now the author is saying that often what happens with India is that whenever India ranks below in a particular index, India questions the relevance of that index. For example, this also happens when there are release of the ranking of the educational institutes. So in all such cases, India has a tendency to question the relevance of the index. However, if India scores well in an index, then India appreciates that index. For example, the ease of doing business index, for long India was not performing on this index, and in that regard India used to criticize the ease of doing business index. However, last year India improved by 30 ranks and got a ranking of 100. So immediately when India got a better ranking, India started saying that ease of doing business index is the best index, or it is one of the most relevant index. So this kind of a hypocrisy is what the editorial is highlighting, that despite the fact that India has gotten a low rank on this index, it is not something that needs to be brushed aside. Rather, it is a cause of major concern is what is being advocated here. The second issue which is important is with regards to some recent policy initiatives. Now here the author is saying that despite the fact that India has some recent policy initiatives, India has performed bad. So some summary of the policy initiatives has been given. For example, India has decided that it is going to have stricter environmental standards for coal-fired power plants. It is going to launch the Bharat Stage 6 emission norms, which shall be bypassing the Bharat Stage 5 norms. And also there is a roadmap for ensuring only electric vehicles to be produced in the country by 2030. Another thing is with regards to the renewable energy. India has committed to producing 100 gigawatt of solar energy by 2022. Also there is a cleanliness drive in the Ganga under the program of the Namami Gange. Also, India wants to ensure a complete electrification of all its railway tracks. So these are definitely some of the policy initiatives that the government is taking. However, despite that, there is a failure. So what is the cause of this failure? Now, this cause is something that has been analyzed. The cause is that of a gap between goals and action, says the editorial. Also, there is a cause of diluted norms. Often the government sets high norms and then later it dilutes its own norms. That is something that the author is advocating here. Another thing is that the norms are sometimes very, very lofty. For example, the norm of the idea that India is going to have completely electric vehicles by the year 2030 is something that the author is saying is highly flawed, because many of the automobile companies themselves have said that this is not a possibility before 2047. So that is one analysis which has been given. Another thing that has been highlighted here is a report by the Comptroller and Auditor General, where he has criticized the Namami Gange program for not implementing the program well and for not spending of the funds which have been allocated. So that is one cause of concern. So all of these issues are what are responsible for the failure of these otherwise well-intended policy initiatives. So that is one analysis. Another thing is that the editorial delves into the age-old debate between environment and economy. Now, is the environmental degradation a cost that the country should pay for its economic development? In this regard, the editorial gives some facts. For example, it says that India faces 1.4 million premature deaths every year. Also, there is a welfare loss of 8% of the GDP. So all of these bring to an analysis that this debate between environment and economy is a flawed one, and there is no debate, because any amount of environmental degradation is ultimately going to result in economic losses, because if there are going to be premature deaths, or if there is going to be disability and disease in the people, then it is going to lead to a loss of labor. It is going to cost excessive health expenditure. So it is in any case going to lead to downward trend of the economy. It is going to lead to GDP losses. So this debate needs to end, and both need to develop together. So that is something that has been advocated. Another thing is with regards to the discriminatory impacts. Now this is again a very important analysis. Here you need to understand that environmental pollution and environmental degradation has discriminatory impacts. It doesn't impact the rich as much as it impacts the poor. So there is a social cost which the country is paying because of this environmental degradation. For example, if climate change is happening, then definitely the farmer is getting more impacted than the industrialist. So this is something that the author has highlighted. This is also what India has said on global fora. For example, India has said that countries like the US had been polluting, and today India is facing the brunt of that. So if India is advocating something to others at the international stage, then India does need to implement it for itself also. This is something that is important. Another thing is with regards to hard decisions. This, the editorial says, that is something that the government needs to take. These hard decisions are with regards to pricing of petrol and diesel, and that prices of petrol and diesel need to be raised to compensate for the policy, environmental policy initiatives which the government wants to fund. So that is something that has been advocated here. Another thing is that the author criticizes the government for having a lack of a political will to overcome this environmental degradation. So that is something. And another point that he has raised is that he hopes this environmental index and this ranking that India has received is a wake-up call for India, and it is not brushed under the carpet. So that is something that has been analyzed. Indeed, this figure is of importance. Whenever you have a question on environment in the UPSC mains paper, you will be expected to quote this figure now. So that is the relevance of this editorial. Coming to the next article, rebuilding our cities. Now this topic is not a very important one because it has not been discussed very technically, but yes, it has some de novo points. So that is the relevance, and we shall be focusing on those specifically. Now the context is very general. It is about the rebuilding and revitalizing of Indian cities. Now issues that have been discussed are, first and foremost, the issue is that of cities in India being a dynamic entity. Now this is a good analysis here. Contrary to various foreign countries or various beliefs in the past, for example, the author is bringing about an analysis that in the aftermath of independence, the leaders thought that the cities in India will grow on a set pattern and they will largely comprise of the middle classes. But this is something that has not happened. And at present, the middle class comprise a very small section in the urban areas, and largely there are a large number of urban poor and there are migrant workers. So cities in India are a dynamic entity because they are continuously changing and they have a huge variation is what has been advocated here. The second issue that has been analyzed is with regards to antiquated urban policy. Now here the author brings about an analysis. He says that because the leaders had in the past thought that cities are going to pan out in a particular manner, and this has not been realized, so the policies were also largely antiquated. This was with regards to the laws, the civic regulation, the building parameters. Now for instance, in Delhi there could be a law that only 4 floors are allowed in a particular building. However, this might not be valid in the current times considering the population burden on Delhi. So it might be required that the building should have more number of floors. So these kind of regulations is something that need to be dovetailed with the present needs rather than focused upon the antiquated dynamics of the city. So that is what has been advocated here, and this idea you can replicate in your answers. Another thing is that he has analyzed the impacts of liberalization. In the aftermath of liberalization, the editorial discusses that there has been a severe change in the dynamics of the city, in the demography of the city, because in the aftermath of liberalization, a large number of blue collar jobs is what increased, and as a result of which a large number of rural workers migrated to the urban areas and they stayed there, and they are today also working in these urban centers, and they still do not have the facilities of urban centers because they are living in slum areas. And contrary to the previous belief that the urban centers will be very posh and they will be based on European models, the current scenario is not that. So that is something that has been analyzed, and the urban centers in India are largely crowded. So all of these issues are what has been analyzed here. Another thing is that of a case of West Africa versus Europe. Now here the author says that the governments in the past have largely been obsessed with a European form of urbanization. They try to make cities in India a replica of European cities, for example, London or Copenhagen. Here the author says that it is a flawed idea to adopt the patterns of Europe, because urbanization in Europe did not happen on the same lines as urbanization is happening in India. A closer example instead is of the West African countries where urbanization is on similar patterns. There is a huge mix of people who are living in the urban centers. It includes rural people, it includes migrants, it includes lower middle class, it includes middle classes, it includes the elite. So definitely there is a huge variety of people. So the way these West African cities are designing, it is this model which India should adopt compared to the European model. So this is something that has been advocated here. Another thing is with regards to demographic changes. Here the author is advocating that demographic changes are something that are happening rapidly in these cities, and they're happening at such a pace that the policy is failing to match up to this, and the policy of the government should keep a pace with these demographic changes. So that is what has been analyzed here. Now the entire relevance of this issue is of all these issues is that the author is advocating that the government should not follow a set pattern of urbanization. It should rather adopt a newer idea of urbanization. For example, European model might have some focus on cultural centers and stadiums. This is something that is not needed in the Indian scenario. In the Indian scenario, what is needed is something that is coming from the people themselves, which is largely based on the comfort and the familiarity of the people. For example, the present dynamics in the urban centers is such that 80% of the people are rural migrants. So it might happen that they would prefer medans, they would prefer some temporary bazaars, they would prefer some melas, because these are the traditional concepts in India, and these concepts need to be replicated in the Indian cities. So that is the advocacy that the editorial is making. So this is the idea that you should replicate in your answers also. Now some suggestions have been given in the editorial. These suggestions, there's a 3 suggestion pattern that has been given. The first suggestion that the author says is that a policy should be adopted that the focus of the government should be on the majority. Here, if 80% of the people are migrant workers, then the focus of the government should be on these 80% only, and it should make all the laws which are targeting these 80%, and it should not focus on the urban elite in the cities. So that is one option that the governments can follow for designing the cities, for rebuilding the cities. The second option is that they can focus on the 20% only and ignore the 80%, and they could make the urban spaces as somehow controlled areas and undemocratic spaces. For example, if they have a park in an urban center, then they can ban the 80% from entering this park, and they could set some limitations that only few people can enter, people who are have a particular education or who are particularly employed. So only those people can enter this park. So either that can be an option. Then the author himself says that both these options are not viable, they are not feasible, they are not sustainable. So these both options are not to be used. And the third option is what is important. The third option is where a society or an urban space which is largely divergent and it is all inclusive. Also, this urban space should have an integration and a cultural cohesion. It should have a blissful living for people unaware of others' presence, class, or economic status. So what is important is that a combination is adopted of all the people, and a dynamic space is created for them where the aspirations of all the groups is met. For example, if there is an a rural migrant worker, he should also have a space in the urban center. He should also have his needs and his markets in the urban center. And if there is an urban elite, even his needs should be met. So that is a balance what is being advocated in this editorial. The editorial, as I mentioned before, also is not very much important, but definitely this idea is new and it can be used in your answers. Now coming to the next article, banking on good faith. The context is with regards to the recapitalization of banks. This is in the backdrop of the rising non-performing assets of the bank. Now there are 21 public sector banks which the government has decided that it is going to recapitalize these banks, and government has decided that it is going to it is going to ensure a 2.11 lakh crore of recapitalization program for these 21 public sector banks. So that is the entire context and background of this issue of recapitalization of banks. Now some issues have been discussed in the editorial. The first is with regards to ensuring a revival of credit. This is something that the country is faced with, is one of the major roadblocks to the economic growth in the country, that because the banks are burdened by the NPAs, they are failing to revive the credit chains in the country, and this is further having a chain impact on the economic growth. So it is anticipated that if the government is going to invest 2.11 lakh crore in the recapitalization, it is going to result in a 5 lakh crore spur in the economic activity. So it is going to be a good deal, a profitable deal for the government. So that is one analysis which has been given. Another thing is with regards to the sources for recapitalization. Here, not only the government is one source, definitely government is recapitalizing the banks. For this, the government will ensure budgetary resources. So government budget is one source. Other sources are like the markets as a source. The banks can explore market options for recapitalization. Also, there is an idea of recapitalization bonds which the bank are envisaging. So these are some sources through which these losses of the banks can be plugged. So that is one detail which has been given in the editorial. Another thing which has been analyzed is with regards to the prompt and corrective action framework. Now, amongst these 21 banks, the RBI has set aside 11 banks which are the topmost priority of the RBI. With regards, these banks have been specifically selected to conserve capital and avoid risk as they are facing greater challenges. And these 11 public sector banks are under the scheme of the prompt corrective action framework, and greater funding is going to be done to these 11 public sector banks. So that is what has been analyzed. Another thing is with regards to the Basel III regimes which India is going to adopt from the year 2019. So in this respect, again, the Basel III regime calls for a greater capital adequacy ratio, and by the capital adequacy ratio in generally mean that the banks will have to have more coverage of capital for the loans that they give. That means the banks need to have more cushioning for the loans that they're giving. They need to be more protected. So in that regard, the government is now recapitalizing the banks so that the Indian banks can meet these norms of the Basel III regime. So that is something that has been analyzed. Another thing is with regards to cushioning for possible haircuts. Now, in the present scenario where the government is dealing with its NPAs and various insolvency resolution processes are taking place, in many cases the banks will have to go for possible haircuts. Now, what is this possible haircuts means that the banks will have to face some losses on the loans which they have given, on the loans which have been declared as non-performing assets. So in that regard, some cushioning should be provided to these banks to reduce their vulnerability. So for this reason, recapitalization of banks has been done by the RBI. So that is, and the government. So that is what has been analyzed here. Another thing is that bankers as an article of faith. Now, the faith of the system of the citizens in the banking system is something that is of utmost importance. You need to understand that the faith of the citizenry in the banking system is at its lowest. Not only in India and globally, this is a cause of concern. Even the rise of the bitcoins is being seen as a cause for this eroding faith in the banking system. So it's just to restore this faith, the government has ensured a recapitalization of banks. So this is something that has been analyzed. Another thing is with regards to the financial resolution and deposit insurance legislation. Now, this is a legislation which is coming up for which is going to deal with the insolvency of the banks itself, and as per this legislation there is a clause of bail-in, and in this clause it was decided that if a bank fails, then in such case the deposit of the depositors is going to be used to bail in the bank. So this was hugely criticized, and this was something that was a major cause of concern, and it eroded the confidence of the depositors in the bank. So here an analysis has been drawn that if the government has asserted in this case of the NPAs that it is going to assure the article of faith in the banks of the citizens, so the people should take this as a confidence building measure with regards to the FRDI bill also. So that is one analysis which has been given. Another thing is with regards to the rating agencies. The rating agencies have welcomed this recapitalization of the banks of India, and you also know that the Moody's had recently upgraded India's credit rating. So in that regard, this was vital that this rating is sustained. So in that regard, also recapitalization of banks is warranted. Another thing is with regards to the issue of structural reforms. Now, this is one of the major criticisms that this policy of recapitalization of banks is facing. Now, the issue is that even if the government recapitalizes the bank, there needs to be an infrastructure set up to ensure that the mistakes by the banks are not repeated. So that is a cause of concern, and to ensure that this insulation is provided, structural reforms are what are required. For example, governance issues of the banks need to be addressed. There needs to be a closer monitoring of the big ticket loans that these banks are giving. There needs to be an identifying of the niche areas where the bank has some strengths and then leveraging those strengths. So those are some advocacies. Also, there's a need to restrict corporate exposure to 25%. Some new performance management systems are what have been advocated in the banking sector. So the package that the government is giving should be an all-encompassing one, and it should not be focused only on one aspect, which is recapitalization. There are other aspects like of restructuring and reforming of banks is something that again should be followed. So that has been analyzed here. Another thing is with regards to an issue of privatization. Here the case of IDBI Bank has been brought about. Now, initially the government had said that it is going to privatize this one bank, though government has been reluctant on privatizing the other public sector banks, but exclusively it had decided that it was going to privatize the IDBI Bank. However, the recent recapitalization package of the government is largely in the favor of the IDBI Bank. So the editorial makes a claim that the government is giving some mixed signal, and this lack of clarity should not happen, and the government should give a clear picture as to what it intends to do. So that is what has been analyzed in this editorial. The editorial indeed is important. This topic of NPAs and recapitalization of banks is indeed the most important economic topic. So that is what is the relevance of this article. With this, we finish today's discussion. I thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you tomorrow. Thank you.